Hello, everybody. Welcome to BeerSmith Podcast number 55. Just got a couple quick announcements. I am going to be moving offices, so the podcast schedule may get thrown off a couple days here and there during the move. But I hope to be broadcasting from my new office for the next podcast, which will be 56 in a couple weeks. Also working really hard on the full version of BeerSmith for mobile apps. That'll be Android and so on. And I just recently got that into beta testing and hoping to have that out within a month or two. Now, without further ado, let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Denny Conn. He's a member of the Cascade Brewers Society, the American Homebrewers Association Governing Committee member, and he has a website at dennybrew.com. Denny, it's great to have you back on the show.
Always great to talk to you, Brad.
So how you doing?
Good, man. Things are going well, gearing up for the conference this year, and I'm real glad that I'm not on the organizing committee this year.
I heard rumors it sold out again. Is that true?
It's sold out in 20 hours.
20 hours? Wow.
Yeah.
Almost twice as fast as last year, huh?
Yeah, and we upped the capacity to 3,400 this year, and it sold out in 20 hours. So it's pretty insane. Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to have a booth again. I'll be there again, and I think I'm speaking as well again. Yeah. Looking forward to it. Should be fun. In fact, I'm believe it or not, I'm speaking on this very topic that we're going to talk about today.
Oh, really? Great.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about recipe design. So I'm taking notes as we go here.
All right, man.
But yeah, so today we're going to talk a little about recipe design, and I know you did an article, I think it was in Zymergy last summer, right?
That's correct.
It was, well, actually I got it here, May, June 2012, Zymergy.
Right.
And so I just thought we'd start at the very beginning. When you sit down with a blank sheet of paper to imagine a new recipe, how do you start?
Well, I guess the obvious thing is that I think about what I want to drink. What sounds good. I try to imagine the flavors, even the situation I'm going to be enjoying that beer in, and try and create a beer that will fit my taste and the way I want to drink it, and then just kind of go from there once I get a firm picture in my head of the flavors that I want to have.
And how is there any particular process you go through to sort of imagine it, or?
Well, I use what I call my taste imagination, where it's like I said, I kind of sit back and I think about, what is it that I want to be experiencing when I drink this beer? Do I want a full body, a light body? Do I want something real clean and snappy and straight ahead? Do I want something a little bit more complex? A good example is the way I went about envisioning my bourbon vanilla imperial porter that I write about in the magazine article. It was coming up on Christmas, and my wife and I were sitting on the couch, coincidentally drinking beers. And I kind of said, I want to come up with a beer for Christmas. Okay, so it's winter time. That generally means maybe like a darker beer, maybe kind of a stronger beer, maybe like something like a porter, maybe like a rich chocolatey imperial porter. It'd be nice to maybe barrel age it and get some of those notes in it, but I don't really have the time to do that. So, if you put a beer in a barrel, sometimes you get kind of like vanilla notes. And if it's a bourbon barrel, you might get some bourbon notes out of it. So how about, making an imperial porter that has, say, bourbon and vanilla in it. And then you just kind of I sat there and kind of imagined how those flavors would balance out until I got to the point where I could actually kind of taste that beer in my mind, as strange as that may sound.
So are you the kind of guy who sits down and starts with a particular style in mind, or maybe you start more? I know there's two schools of thought here.
Yeah, it can go both ways. And again, it kind of depends on what I'm in the mood for. Sometimes I'm in the mood for giving myself the challenge of brewing strictly to a style and seeing how closely I can hit it. More often, I kind of give myself the goal of a flavor that I'm going for. even with things like my rye IPA recipe, it started off as an IPA, but then it kind of like evolved around to getting other flavors into that IPA. So, there's really two approaches there. I think, at least for me, the idea is to have a goal in mind when I start. I do occasionally just throw stuff together to see what will happen. And I have to admit that more often than not, I'm kind of disappointed in what comes out of it. I don't know if just don't have the intuitive sense that some people have. But for me, I really it's like in the article I talk about, if you're taking a trip in a car, you need to have a map to get there, because if you don't know how to get where you're going, then you don't ever know when you've gotten there.
Well, what role does research play? Do you do a lot of research typically?
I mean, yeah, there's a number of ways you can do research. Drinking beers and taking note of the flavors in them.
That's my favorite form of research.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can't think of anybody I know who doesn't really enjoy that kind of research. It's kind of like, whoa, now that beer kind of tastes like, has this flavor to it. I wonder if that's something I could incorporate into one of my beers sometimes. And then the other thing that I do is that I will take a look at a lot of different recipe books and kind of, get an overview of ways to approach a particular recipe. I look at Jamil and John's Brewing Classic Styles. Mm-hmm. That's always a great reference. One of my favorite books that is out of print and hard to find, but if you can find it, is well worth it, is Greg Noonan's 7 Barrels Brewery book. There are a lot of great recipes in there. The AHA Recipe Wiki has a lot of really good award-winning recipes online. So I kind of like look at all of those and try and analyze the ingredients and techniques in those recipes and what each one of those ingredients and techniques brings to that particular recipe, and then kind of make an amalgamation of all of those, for my own recipe.
So kind of like designing great beers, Ray Daniels, he took a whole bunch of award-winning recipes and sort of averaged them all together.
Yeah, that's a really good example. That's another really good reference book, although you have to take into account the age of that book and the changes that have come about in ingredients since then. When Designing Great Beers was written, we didn't have access to a lot of the continental malts and some of the other stuff that we have today. Mm-hmm. So people kind of tried to make substitutions for those. So you have to be aware of that. But on the other hand, it's a great reference when you put it together with all these other things.
Mm-hmm. So let's say you got your overall objective defined. What do you do next? Do you sit down and try and define the grain bill, or how do you approach the actual design next?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Once I've looked at these various recipes and gotten an idea of the various grains that people use, like I said, I try and imagine what each one of those grains is going to bring to the beer flavor-wise and in what amount. So then I kind of sit down and I do my first pass at putting together the grist bill for my own recipe, depending on, what I've decided that I want it to do. I think about the hops. Do I want it to have a sharp, intense hop character, maybe a more laid-back character in terms of bittering, more or less hop flavor, more or less hop aroma? I just get an idea of where all those things lie on the continuum in my head there. Sorry about knocking the mic.
That's okay.
And start putting the recipe together. But, I very seldom am lucky enough to hit what I'm going for the very first time through. I rebrew. I brew it. I brew a test batch. I analyze it. Then I kind of see what's happening. A good example is when I was making a coffee oatmeal stout. I put together the kind of stout recipe I wanted, kind of medium bodied, roasty, but not too roasty, balanced in terms of the hopping and stuff. But then I discovered that when I added the coffee to it, that the bitterness of the coffee kind of like overwhelmed the rest of the beer and made the beer too bitter. So I had to go back and brew another test batch with that, reducing the bittering hops and stuff, and until I got it done. Rye IPA recipe probably took me 5 to 8 iterations before I got it to where I wanted it to be, and then I brewed it another 5 times in a row exactly like that to make sure that it was going to be repeatable and really was what I wanted it to be. I know there's a lot of homebrewers who don't like doing that, you know, who think that, the idea is just being able to put things together and brew it and then move on and brew something different. And they take great pride in never brewing the same thing twice. That's great. Everybody has their own way of doing things, their own reason for doing things, their own style of doing things. Me, I enjoy coming up with an idea and working until I can achieve that goal that I have in my head.
And so, I had this for later, but I was wondering, what do you do to evaluate the beer when you're done? How do you know what to adjust next? Let's say you're going iteration to iteration to iteration. Yeah,
well, I mean, with the rye IPA, that was a beer that I was brewing specifically to my wife's tastes. We have a big birthday party every year for her, and she likes really hoppy IPAs. So I would change things based on her comments, not enough rye character, too much rye character, not hoppy enough. I don't think she ever said it was too hoppy, So, and otherwise, it's just, like with the coffee stout, it was a question of sitting down and drinking a glass and going, wow, the stout itself is really lost behind the bitterness of the coffee and the hops here. I need to cut that back. I need to maybe add some more sweetness to balance out the coffee. So maybe I'll increase the amount of crystal malt that I'm using in there, use a darker or lighter crystal. So really what you have to do is draw up that taste imagination and, get to where that beer was when you first imagined it in your head. And then really, as objectively as possible, try and analyze the beer that you're drinking and compare it to what you had in your head.
Well, you talk about how important it is to know your ingredients. And what do you mean by that, I guess?
Well, if you're going to make changes in a beer, you have to have an idea of what the ingredients that you're going to change are doing to that beer in the first place. Mm-hmm. Of course, one way of doing that is just throwing a bunch of stuff together and seeing what comes out of the fermenter when you do that. But then you really don't know what each grain or hop is contributing to that beer. So there's a couple different ways you can go about that. Number one is to rebrew the same recipe multiple times, changing only one thing in that recipe each time. Brew a pale ale and one time put 20-degree crystal in it. The next time put 60-degree crystal in it. The next time put 120-degree crystal in it. That'll give you a really good idea of the way of what each one of those grains is going to add to that beer. Mm-hmm. The other thing you can do is make little tasting teas with those grains and hops and see what they're like. For the grains, I take about 4 ounces of water, heat it up in the microwave till it gets to be about 150 degrees. Dump in a few tablespoons of crushed grain and let that steep for half an hour or so. And you may need to stick it back in the microwave to keep the temperature up, But basically what you're doing is a real small mash in a bowl or a coffee cup. When you get all that done, I put a coffee filter into a strainer and strain that mini mash through it. And you can get a real good idea of the different flavors in the grains. Now, of course, this is all pre-fermentation. And so those flavors are going to change. But at least it's a really good way of comparing one grain to another and seeing what that grain is going to bring to your beer. Same thing with hops. You can do something very similar with hops.
Make like a hop tea?
Yeah. The thing to be aware of with that is that, in my opinion at least, hop tea is some of the grossest, most vile, disgusting, harsh vegetable stuff I have ever tasted, and I can barely get myself to take a little sip of it and taste it. So it's a really, I mean, it is really good for is comparing one hop to another. You know, you can get a really good idea of the relative qualities that way. You get less of an idea of the absolute qualities of that hop because it's really hard to tell. Another thing you can do with hops, of course, is to analyze the aroma, just kind of crush them by rubbing them between your hands and take a big sniff, and that'll give you a really good idea of the hop aroma. Mm-hmm. So then once you have, I mean, and you take notes as you're doing all this, you know, that's very important, whether you're brewing or tasting ingredients or whatever. Take notes as you go so that you have a memory, a written memory of the techniques you use and the flavors that come out. And then sit down and look through all these notes and then start thinking about how these ingredients will complement each other and in what quantities. A lot like you do in your cooking. The real difference is that when we make beer, we have to wait a few weeks minimum to find out how we guessed, unlike cooking, you know?
Yeah. A few episodes back, we had Drew Beecham on. He's talking about smash brewing. What are your thoughts on that? Good way to get familiar with your ingredients, maybe?
It is a really good way to get familiar with your ingredients. My own opinion is that smash beers themselves, I find a bit boring and one-dimensional. You know, I have yet to brew one or taste one that just really blew me away as a beer. And, you know, that includes when I was at beer camp at Sierra Nevada, they had a whole bunch of single malt, single hop beers on tap, so you could really get an idea of like the characteristics of the hops that they grew and stuff. And that's an excellent way to do that.
Perhaps better for a mini batch, huh?
Well, yeah, if you want to do that. I mean, you know, and again, it just depends on people's tastes. There's a lot of people who brew smash beers and go, boy, I just love this beer. I just tend to, in general, find them a little bit one-dimensional and boring. But on the other hand, I've brewed them because it is a really, really great way to become familiar with ingredients. Brew an all Munich pale ale, you know, using Munich for 100% of your grist and one hop, and I guarantee you that you will come out of there knowing what those two ingredients taste like.
Now, what about sugars? Are you a big fan of using sugar?
Definitely so. I brew a lot of Belgian styles, and sugars are real appropriate for those. Between the stuff from Dark Candy, and I especially love the stuff that CandySyrup.com is making. They have a real wide range of sugars and candy syrups with some great flavors to them. I like using Demerara sugar, Piancillo, you know, various things like that can be really, really useful in aiding the overall development of the beer, whether it's a sugar that doesn't have much flavor that you use to adjust the body, or something like one of the dark candy syrups that pretty much define the flavor of a beer just on their own. They really can be real useful in that. And talk about tasting ingredients, man. All of that stuff is wonderful to taste on its own. You know, taste some dark candy syrup just on its own, and you may find yourself putting it in your coffee every day.
Yeah, I don't brew with a lot of sugar, so I'm kind of interested in what kind of flavors can you bring out? What does it add?
You know, it's really interesting. Some of the, again, you know, I've brewed probably the most with some of the stuff from CandySyrup.com. And they have some lighter ones that I've used in a triple that really kind of like add almost a honey quality to it. The really dark stuff that they have is great for bringing out kind of like rum and raisin and fig flavors in a beer. Put that, well, obviously like a triple or something along the lines of a Belgian dark strong, or even an old ale. If you're into brewing English styles, some of those darker syrups can really deepen the flavor of an old ale.
Really?
Yeah.
What about miscellaneous ingredients? Things like flavorings, additions, spices.
And all that stuff has its place. One thing I do say in the article is be careful what you wish for. Just because you like eating a dill pickle as you drink a beer doesn't necessarily mean that a dill pickle beer is going to be a really good idea.
Yeah.
Now, and I use that example because online I've seen people specifically talk about brewing something like that. And of course, everybody's tastes differ. So I would say if you're getting into the really wild ingredients, then be sure that it's going to be something you like, or brew a small batch first to find out. On the other hand, speaking of wild ingredients, I've put Chanterelle mushrooms into a wee heavy before, several times, based on a recipe of Randy Mosher's that he calls Nirvana, and I guarantee you it is.
So what do the mushrooms add to the overall flavor there?
Chanterelles have this really nice kind of buttery, apricot-y flavor that goes brilliantly with the rich maltiness of a wee heavy. I use Scott Abean's technique of doing a boil down for the wee heavy, where you take a gallon of your first runnings and boil it down until you have just a couple pints of this really heavy syrup. Add that back in with the rest of the beer, and then add the Chanterelle mushrooms to the secondary after it's fermented out, and it is. I mean, those flavors just sing together. It's truly amazing. I'm a bit of a heretic on how I add things to the beer. I count on the low pH and the alcohol content of the finished beer to pretty much keep it safe from infection. I've made that Chanterelle beer a number of times. I've tried the technique of like where you soak the chanterelles in vodka, add that. Even with a little bit of vodka, I could detect the extra heat from it in the beer, and I just did not like it. So I made this leap of faith, and
when did you add them in?
I add the Chanterelles after the beer has been fermenting, maybe 3-4 weeks, something like that. I'm lucky enough to have a woods in back of my house where I can go out and pick the Chanterelles myself. So I do what I do with them is I just brush the dirt off. They don't get washed or anything. I brush the dirt off. I chop them up. I vacuum seal them in a bag, which draws a lot of the moisture out. I put them in the freezer and let them freeze solid. That helps break down the cell walls and get a lot more of the flavor out of them. So then you take them out of the freezer, thaw them out, and you get a bag of the Chanterelle mushrooms and all this liquid. Put that into a secondary, rack the beer on top, and just let it sit for a few weeks. It works great. I've done the same thing with blueberries. So far, I have never had any problems by using that method, and I far prefer it to soaking the things in alcohol first.
Right.
I know that a lot of people who make my bourbon vanilla imperial porter recipe will soak their vanilla beans in bourbon before they put them in. I had considered that, but I didn't know how much bourbon I wanted to use in this beer. We'll get to that in a second here. So I decided that, again, I would just simply put the vanilla beans into the secondary, and then I would add the bourbon to taste at bottling time, and it's worked out great for me. Now, the technique I use for that and for the coffee for deciding how much is when I'm ready to either bottle or keg the beer, I'll pour 4 2-ounce samples of the beer, before I put in priming sugar if I'm bottling it. And then I add a different measured amount of whatever I'm going to add, bourbon, coffee, whatever kind of flavoring I'm going to use, to each one. Then you taste those, decide which one you like best, and scale that amount of the flavoring up to the size of your batch. It's a much more precise method than just pouring some in. Again, on the internet, I see all people asking all the time, "Oh, how much coffee should I put in my beer?" The answer is whatever tastes good to you.
Yeah.
And that's how you decide what tastes good to you.
No, that's good advice. We're in the process, we're in your overall design process. Do you actually sit down and talk about process issues like, what mash temperature you're going to use, what mash techniques you might use, what hop techniques you might use?
I do that really early on, at the same time that I'm designing the grist and hop bill for the beer. When I've got this idea in my head of where we're going with this thing, I think about, okay, do I want to use a higher mash temperature and give the beer a little bit more body and maybe sweetness? Do I want to go for a lower mash temperature? How are things that I'm going to be adding to this beer later on going to possibly affect the temperature that I want to mash at? Mm-hmm. If I want more hop flavor, then I'll go with first wort hopping on the beer. If I want a really strong hop aroma, then I'll kind of decide what hops I'm going to use when to give me that aroma. Do I want the aroma to be flowery? Do I want it to be piney? Do I want it to be citrusy? So that's kind of like integrated into the overall design process.
What about yeast selection and fermentation?
Yeah, that obviously can play a huge role on the beer. Unlike with the hops and malts, where you can make a tea and get an idea of what you're going to be getting from them, with yeast, you really have no choice but to just brew and get an idea for that yeast. But up front, you can decide what kind of contribution do you want the yeast to make to the beer. Do you want it to make very little contribution and so that the other ingredients really come through? I mean, do you want it to have fruity qualities that it contributes to the beer? Do you want it, do you want to need a hef yeast for that, some of that banana and clove flavor? So, again, you have to decide what role the yeast is going to play. And to me, that's the biggest thing about recipe design. Don't put something into the beer unless you can tell yourself why it's there and what it's going to add to the overall flavor of the beer. And the yeast is a real good example of that. Do you want it to step back and get out of the way, or do you want to use a Belgian yeast that, along with some dark syrup, is going to pretty much define what that beer tastes like?
I know a lot of people, especially early on, tend to throw everything but the kitchen sink in. That's it's sort of how it was for me when I started designing my first few recipes. I tended to put everything in there.
Yeah, and that's very true, which comes to the question, is a simple recipe the best recipe? A lot of people think it is. I say, yes, a simple recipe is always the best recipe, except for when it's not. You should be using anything in your beer that will achieve the results that you want to achieve, but you should also think about why that ingredient is in the beer. If you can't tell yourself why it's there, if you can't taste it in your head and get an idea of what that ingredient is going to do to the beer, take it out of there.
No, I agree. Well, what other resources would you recommend for researching or learning more about recipe design?
Well, drinking lots of beers and taking notes is always a good way to go about it, as we said earlier.
Yeah.
The idea is to take notes about it. And I'm a big fan of tasting a beer while you say, like, read through the BJCP guidelines. Another excellent book, out of print, but you can find around still, is Michael Jackson's New World Guide to Beer. The way he writes about beer and describes flavors will bring ideas to your head that you haven't had before because you never thought about it that way. So yeah, it's a great idea to go out and, before I brew a style, especially one I haven't brewed before, I'll go out and try and get a commercial example of that beer, or 2 or 3 different commercial examples. Sit down, read the BJCP style guidelines while I'm drinking those beers, try to taste the flavors they're talking about, take notes about what I actually do taste, take notes when you brew your own test batches about what's there, what you like, what you don't like, what you think made it taste a particular way, what you might change if you did it a different way. Look at books like Brewing Classic Styles, Designing Great Beers, 7 Barrels Brewery. Look at those recipes, analyze them about, what is each ingredient doing to that beer. If he's using this mash temperature, why would that work for that beer? And that's the big thing right there. Read books, taste beers, talk to other brewers, get ideas, and then try it for yourself and take notes.
I know you talked about the importance of iteration earlier, but do you have a structured approach for sort of judging your own beer? Do you sit down and try and judge it like somebody might for a competition, or how do you do it?
Generally, no, I don't do that. Generally, what I do is, if I'm really organized, I've taken notes from my taste imagining the beer before I brewed it. Otherwise, I just try to think back on what it was I intended for this beer, and sit there and sip it thoughtfully and think about, okay, how close did I come to my goal? What is it that I need to change the next time to get closer to what I was going for? Or was this whole thing a bad idea, like a dill pickle beer, and one batch of it is enough?
Yeah, jalapeno beer was one that I remember that did not turn out well.
Early on in my brewing career, when I was looking through Charlie's New Complete Joy of Home Brewing, I noticed his recipe for goat scrotum porter, a basic straight-ahead porter recipe, and then he gives you this whole list of other things you can add to it. And he said, pick a few and throw them in there. So I remember I put in molasses and spruce tips, and I think I put in a couple other things. Yeah. I ended up with 5 gallons of beer that kind of tasted like cough syrup, and nobody would drink.
A friend of mine went overboard with the spruce. He actually bought spruce flavoring and then used like the whole bottle of it.
Oh my goodness.
And it tasted, the closest thing I could describe, it tasted like something like pine tar, basically, when we were done. It was pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, my wife tends to like hoppier beers anyway, but when I made that spruce molasses porter, it was like, if I even got it near her where she could smell it, it was. I mean,
it can be great, but you got to use it very sparingly.
It can, and again, it depends a lot on your personal taste.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we brew, so that we can make the beer that we want to drink. But, it's like these days when I see somebody post online that they're going to make a spruce beer, I always ask, have you ever tried a spruce beer?
Yeah.
If they haven't, encourage them to do that before they brew one, because sometimes an idea sounds more interesting than it tastes.
So do you have any final tips for somebody like just starting out designing beer? Let's say you're making that transition from you've been buying kits and doing all that, and now you want to just sit down and design your first beer. I was wondering if you had any tips for somebody just starting out.
I would say analyze what was in those kits that made you like one and not like another one, for instance. What about it was it that you liked? I would say brew that beer over and over. When you design your recipe, brew it over and over again until you get what you're going for. Don't get discouraged. Don't get bored brewing the same thing. You're learning something that's going to be really valuable down the line. And, just have an idea where you're going before you start. It's like I said about the map. If you don't have a map, if you don't have a goal in mind, then you don't know when you get there.
Well, Denny, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I'll see everybody at NHC in Philadelphia this summer.
In June, right?
In June 20. Let me see. I guess I go on the 25th. I guess the conference is like the 28th through 30th, something like that.
That sounds roughly right. Yeah, I don't know exactly.
Yeah.
I'll put the dates in the show notes for anybody that's interested.
That'd be great. All I know is that I go a day early because on the Wednesday before the conference, I spend most of the day in a governing committee meeting. Better than most board meetings, though, because we get beer.
There you go. Well, Denny, thank you very much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
It's the pleasure, Brad. I'll see you in June, and good luck on the move.
Great to have you. And again, today my guest was Denny Conn. He's a member of the Cascade Brewers Society, and he's on the American Homebrewers Association Governing Committee. He has his website again at dennybrew.com. Well, a big thank you to Denny Conn for appearing on the show. Really appreciate him being here. Looking forward to seeing him at the National Homebrew Conference in a couple months. Reminder to you, if you haven't signed up for our email list, you can do so at beersmith.com/blog. And sign up for our email list, and we'll send you an article on homebrewing every week. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.